Richard Nixon is getting his daughter married at the White House. And in the meantime, behind the scenes, this fella, Daniel Ellsberg, has leaked the secret history of the Vietnam War to the New York Times. And on the same Sunday, where there's the picture of Tricia Nixon being married, there's this story about the Pentagon Papers.
Daniel Ellsberg, ex-Pentagon employee, made history by leaking to the New York Times the Pentagon Papers, a top-secret study of Vietnam policy.
Pentagon Papers were 7,000 pages of secret history of the war in Vietnam, commissioned by Robert McNamara, the former Secretary of Defense, who became disillusioned with the war and wanted a full record of how we got into it and how it went wrong.
Nixon reads his newspaper and his daily briefings, doesn't care about it. Most of the Pentagon Papers are about Johnson and Kennedy. They're not about him.
Hello.
Mr. President, I have Dr. Kissinger calling you.
Okay.
But for some reason, Henry Kissinger reads this story in the New York Times and goes ballistic.
It's treasonable, there's no question. It's actionable. I'm absolutely certain that this violates all sorts of security laws.
What do we do about it?
Kissinger is convinced that Daniel Ellsberg, if he had access to the Pentagon Papers, has access to what's going on in Cambodia. And he's obsessed that Ellsberg's next step is to release information about the secret bombing campaign in Cambodia.
10 years in prison was very cheap if they could contribute to ending this war.
Ellsberg was the Kissinger protege, and so Kissinger is worried that the finger eventually is going to come back at him.
Kissinger describes Ellsberg as unhinged.
Of course, that son of a bitch, I know him well. He was, oh, well, from early 69 on, he just went off his rocket. Just totally wild. And he's moved into a more and more intransigent, radical position.
So it's Kissinger that gins up Nixon about Ellsberg.
This kid, son of a bitch, we've got to get him. We've got to get him.
Kissinger's frantic, self-protective reaction to the exposure of the Pentagon Papers drives Nixon to a place which eventually becomes the first step towards Watergate.
From the very beginning of Nixon's administration, Kissinger was running all the major elements of foreign policy. The three major immediate objectives were all with communist countries, China, Russia, and Vietnam. The broad strategy was to know where you want to go over the long run, to see how the pieces fit, so what you did with one country, how it would affect another country. And I think Kissinger felt you had to reconcile the just with the possible.
Vietnam to Kissinger and to Nixon was a thorn in their side. They wanted it off page one so they could get to all the kind of things that Nixon had on his very expansive and aggressive foreign policy plate. You couldn't do those until you had the Vietnam question settled.
The United States seemed hemmed in Vietnam. We seemed unable to do anything right. But Kissinger recognized that there was a lot of power in taking the initiative. He was willing to take risks, and he was able to manufacture opportunities where they did not exist before.
Before they came to power, both Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger thought what might be done with China. I think it took the two of them spending time together contemplating the great chessboard of the Cold War to realize that if we can only establish some communications with China, that could be helpful in a number of ways. It could help you with the Vietnam problem, but could also help you with the Soviets.
We had, for the last few decades, assumed that communism was a seamless whole. Well, suddenly not so much. In the late 60s, you started to see friction and then clashes between the Soviets and the Chinese along border areas. And you had people in the intelligence community saying, hey, rather than being on the same team, these guys are in different teams. There's actually a split, which we began to call the Sino-Soviet Split.
A disputed frontier between the dragon and the bear.
A war broke out, a border dispute between the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. More importantly, there was an ideological battle for leadership of the communist world. This was the setting within which Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger developed perhaps the boldest ploy in all of Cold War statecraft.
Mao's China was probably the most closed country in the world. There were very few people who went in there. So it really was this place on the moon. Nobody really knew what was going on inside.
Mao's policies had reduced China to one of the lowest standards of living in the world. Wretched poverty enforced by the draconian measures of communist rule.
I was born in late 1959, 10 years after the communists took over China. Mao was our red sun, was the savior of China. We were schooled on all this anti-Western propaganda. I grew up seeing this famous Korean War movies called Heroic Children. And in it, you see American soldiers played by Chinese actors with fake noses and white powder. And they were incredibly ridiculous creatures who would be mown down by Chinese machine guns. So that was the very cartoonish picture of Americans that we had in our head.
As we came into office, 1 week after his inauguration,
You, Richard Milhouse Nixon.
Nixon sent a memo to Kissinger and said, get in touch with the Chinese, see what we can do. 1 week, you can see his priority.
This is where the story gets the most cloak and the most dagger. The process of trying to get in touch with Beijing started almost immediately in 1969, but it was extremely difficult because the Chinese were extremely hard to get to.
The Chinese had no diplomatic representatives anywhere in the world. Even having an address where you could confidentially and reliably communicate with the Chinese didn't exist. So what they had to do is find discreet intermediaries who could play that role.
Of all countries, it turned out to be Pakistan that made the connection happen.
Today's highlight is the new ambassador from Pakistan and his family.
And what would happen is that the Chinese would send a secret message which would end up with the Pakistani ambassador in Washington, who would call on Kissinger with the message. In January 1971, we had sent a message and we hadn't heard back for months. And indeed, we got quite nervous.
Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai, the Chinese premier, were great believers in the subtle approach. And so the faintest of signals was sent out from Beijing to the effect that there might possibly be a conversation worth having.